Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I found that speech somewhat staggering in some regards. The member for Macon seems to intimate that because you have got trade with someone, there's no need to have a look at or liberalise those trade agreements. Now, I wonder what the member for Macon would have made of the Hawke and Keating legislation that, for instance, removed tariff barriers and those sorts of issues in the 1980s to liberalise the trade regime. After all, we were trading with those countries before, weren't we? No need to reduce tariffs or anything else because we were trading with them anyway. The point is we want to increase that trade. The member also made note of the issue of jobs and saying, well, the fact that the government's given ground on this indicates that these were valid concerns. The simple fact is, once again, this is an issue where getting this agreement through the Parliament was critical. There are a lot of jobs that are highly dependent on this deal getting through by the end of the year, this legislation getting through. And quite frankly, we weren't going to be hijacked and held hostage to demands as far as all sorts of Labor amendments were concerned, but we certainly conceded on some, not necessarily because they were valid, but simply because realpolitik means that sometimes you have to cut a deal to get legislation through. And in terms of increasing trade or not with a free trade agreement, one needs only look at what happened in New Zealand to see the massive increase they had in their dairy penetration into the Chinese market compared with Australia, to see the value of these free trade agreements. Now, unlocking the experiences of the past and looking to the future, one must recognise that every vote against ChAFTA is a proxy vote for protection, which is essentially what the member for Macon has been arguing. And a vote for protection is, as Churchill put it, a vote to give governments that right of robbing Peter to pay Paul and charging the public a handsome commission on the job. I wish to remind the House that, according to the Leader of the Opposition, this is the year of the big idea. In such a year, one would expect or would be forgiven for thinking that there would be hundreds of ideas. But what is the Labor reality? 5. One idea every 2 months. Staggering. This is indicative of the Labor Party more generally. They're reactive, not proactive. They are negative, small-minded and backward-looking. They're a jealous, envious bunch who believe that the quickest way to the fruit at the top of the tree is to chop that tree down, not to climb the tree. Labor are leaners, not lifters. This ChAFTA debate has been and is a litmus test for Labor's current leadership. It is instructive that in government, Labor resisted a union campaign against the original scheme, and a host of Labor elders from Martin Ferguson, Simon Crean, Peter Beattie, John Brumby and Bob Carr, among others, have welcomed the agreements, as well as a raft of business leaders. While Labor and the unions claim that there may be some benefits in delaying the agreement or seeking to revisit provisions relating to the labour market in a few years, there are undoubtedly huge costs too. The National Farmers Federation have estimated that if an agreement is not put into force by the end of 2015, it could cost the sector $300 million, mainly through having to pay additional tariffs. And Australian industries will continue to suffer as major competitors, such as New Zealand, continue to enjoy preferential treatment after having already signed agreements. This historic agreement is a game changer in so many ways. It truly is more than the sum of its parts. For to really grasp the magnitude of the win that we have here, one really must look to the many positive spillover effects of trade. Trade is the greatest diplomatic tool we have. Trade is one of the best defences, for to trade is to know. With the familiarity earned through trade, there comes an understanding. The language of war should never enter the debate about trade. The transactions of trade, like the quality of mercy, are twice blessed and confer benefits on both parties. China is already the largest single market for Australia's service exports. To date, this has been dominated by education, travel and tourism. In 2014, education, travel and tourism exports to China constituted over 60% of Australia's total services export. China is our largest source of international students, about 29% of the total, and our largest source of tourism expenditure, 18% of the total. Australia's export of other services to China has been less impressive to date. However, ChAFTA lays the foundation for much faster export growth across many services. Chinese consumers have not just burst into the middle class, they have embraced online retail more than just about any other country. Online retail accounted for around 10% of overall sales at the end of 2014, with spending at almost $500 billion during that year. This means that the Chinese online retail market is now larger than the US. It is forecast to rise 13 to 14% by the end of this year. By contrast, online retail accounts for around 7% of sales in Australia and around the same proportion in the United States. Never before has it been so easy for Australian businesses of all sizes across just about every other industry to reach new and expanding markets in China. In my electorate of Tangni, I know that this historic deal with China will mean new market opportunities for the architects, software designers, teachers, accountants, financiers and university in my electorate. I know too that everyone, and not just our hard-working professionals, will benefit from lower prices resulting from the reduction or removal of many tariffs on everyday items. So this trade deal is absolutely consistent with what the coalition took to the election in 2013. It is the product of the coalition government honouring our commitment to the Australian public to deliver relief on cost of living pressures and to create opportunities for economic growth. The Labor Party would rather shrink the economic pie, close our doors and bury our heads to the world of the 21st century. The Union campaign against the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement is a mixture of misinformation, confusion and xenophobia. But it does hide an uncomfortable truth. Labour market protectionism encourages the exploitation of foreign workers. The ACTU argues that ChAFTA will shut out locals from jobs. They point to three controversial provisions. The first is the elimination of labour market testing for Chinese workers in the 457 visa program. But the requirement, quite frankly, has always been a tick-in-the-box waste of time. An independent review last year found it was pointless and cumbersome. There's no evidence that unemployed Australians in any way benefit from this regulatory hurdle. Another controversy relates to skills requirements. The unions say ChAFTA means foreign tradies could come to Australia who do not meet Australian standards. But the skills requirements under ChAFTA are exactly the same as for most other countries we accept skilled workers from. ChAFTA just removes a discriminatory higher bar for Chinese workers. The higher bar still applies I might add, to a small number of other developing countries. The final controversy concerns major projects. A side memorandum to ChAFTA establishes a new type of labour agreement, investor facilitation agreements that allow major infrastructure projects to bring in foreign workers. But we already have similar labour agreements. The essentials of the law haven't changed. Claims that ChAFTA changes existing major project wage requirements are simply wrong. To the extent that there is exploitation in Australian immigration, it is because employers are able to use restrictive visa conditions demanded by unions to protect Australian workers as a stick to wield against foreign visa holders. This is not the occasion for a history lesson, but we should never forget that the history of our two nations is long, rich and complex. We could not imagine modern Australia without China's contribution to our people, our culture and our prosperity. And perhaps above all, in our darkest hour, when our foes were literally on our doorstep, when our cities were under direct military attack, then, at that tipping point in our history, China was our staunch, indefatigable ally. I note that Labor will not pay heed to history, but will be true to it and theirs, for as Churchill once said, men often stumble over the truth, but most of them pick themselves up and hurry off as if nothing had happened.